The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of light and shadow. Neon signs flickered overhead, their reflections dancing in the puddles like restless ghosts. Elena Carter pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders, her fingers numb from the cold as she counted the last few crumpled bills in her pocket. Another long night selling flowers and trinkets near the subway station. Another barely livable wage earned. She sighed, brushing damp strands of auburn hair from her face. The city had never been kind, but tonight it felt particularly cruel. The wind howled through the alleyways, sending discarded newspapers tumbling like specters in the dark. She quickened her pace, eager to reach the worn-down apartment she called home. Then she heard it. A sound so faint, so fragile, that at first she thought it was the wind. A soft, wavering cry, lost amidst the rhythm of raindrops on pavement. She stopped, her heart beating faster, straining to listen. Another cry, this time unmistakable, a baby. Elena turned sharply, scanning the empty street. The cry was coming from a narrow alley, a sliver of darkness wedged between two looming buildings. Hesitation gripped her for a moment. The city was dangerous, especially for a woman alone at night. But something deep inside urged her forward. Steeling herself, she stepped into the shadows. The alley reeked of damp concrete and rotting trash, the kind of place where forgotten things were left to disappear. She followed the sound, her breath shallow until her gaze landed on a small cardboard box wedged between a dumpster and the wall. Her stomach twisted. Kneeling slowly, she reached out and peeled back the soaked cloth draped over the box. Inside, lying amidst torn newspapers and old rags, was a newborn, a tiny boy, no older than a month, his skin pale and fragile. But it wasn't his smallness or vulnerability that made Elena's breath catch. It was his hair. A cascade of soft silver strands curled against his damp forehead, shimmering under the dim alley light. Even in the gloom, they seemed almost luminous, as though the moon itself had left its touch upon him. Elena's hands trembled as she lifted him carefully. His cries quieted the moment she held him close, his tiny fingers curling around the edge of her sleeve, as though he had found an anchor in the storm. A sharp gasp escaped her lips when she noticed the object tangled in the folds of his thin blanket, a pendant. It was small, made of tarnished silver, with an engraving so worn it was nearly unreadable. But when she turned it over in her palm, she could just make out the strange curling symbols etched into its surface, symbols she did not recognize. A chill ran down her spine. Who would leave a child like this? And why? For the briefest moment, she considered taking him straight to the authorities, but something held her back. The way he had stopped crying the moment she touched him, the way his tiny body nestled into her as though he had already decided she was safe. He was abandoned, alone, just like her. Elena made her decision before she even realized it. She tucked the baby into the warmth of her coat and stood, stepping back into the rain. As she walked out of the alley, she could feel something shifting in the night, an invisible force, the weight of an unseen presence watching from the shadows. The city was never truly silent, but now the sound of her footsteps echoed louder than they should have. A wrongness slithered in the air. She turned her head sharply, scanning the empty street. No one was there. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had just noticed what she had done. Elena barely slept that night. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside, but inside, her mind raced. She had placed the baby, Lucas, she decided, on the old couch, wrapped in the least tattered blanket she owned. He had drifted into sleep almost immediately, his tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of life. She sat beside him, staring at the strange silver pendant still clutched in her hand. The symbols carved into it were unlike anything she had ever seen. Elegant, almost otherworldly, like something out of a forgotten language. The edges were worn smooth, suggesting it had been passed down through time, through hands that had held it with reverence. Who had left him? And why? Her fingers brushed against his silvery hair, impossibly soft, glowing faintly in the dim light of her apartment. A child with hair like this, so rare, so striking, would have been treasured. Yet someone had abandoned him in the cold, left him to die like garbage. Elena's jaw tightened. No child deserved that. She pulled her coat tighter around her as she stood and crossed the room to the window, staring down at the dark streets below. The feeling from the alley still clung to her, like feeling from the alley still clung to her, like she was being watched. Even now, as she peered through the cracked blinds, she felt the weight of unseen eyes lurking in the city's underbelly. Lucas stirred behind her, a soft sound escaping his lips. She turned, her heart aching at how small he looked against the worn fabric of the couch. His tiny fingers flexed, grasping at something unseen, and for the briefest moment she swore she saw the pendant glow. A trick of the light, it had to be. Morning came with a hazy, gray light filtering through the window. The storm had passed, leaving the city streets slick and gleaming, reflecting the towering buildings above like fragmented shards of glass, like fragmented shards of glass. Lucas woke with a soft coo, blinking up at her with eyes that were almost too bright, too knowing for a child so small. Elena lifted him carefully, cradling him in her arms. "Guess you're really staying, huh?" she murmured. He responded by gripping the fabric of her sweater, his tiny fingers curling tightly around the worn threads. A warmth spread through her chest, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She had nothing, barely enough money to keep the lights on, and yet, in that moment, she knew with certainty that she could not give him up. Still, questions gnawed at the edges of her mind. The pendant, the strange feeling of being watched, the way the baby's hair shimmered, even in the dim light. She needed answers. After feeding Lucas a bottle of warm milk she had picked up from the corner store, she wrapped him in the least worn blanket she owned and headed out. The market was already alive with movement by the time she reached it. Stalls lined the narrow streets, their vendors calling out prices for fruit, bread, and all manner of cheap trinkets. The familiar scent of roasted coffee and fried dough filled the air. Elena kept her head down, moving quickly past the groups of women who had already started their morning gossip. The neighborhood thrived on whispers, and she could feel their eyes trailing after her, darting toward the bundle in her arms. She approached the old antique shop at the far end of the market, its crooked wooden sign swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the smell of dust and aged paper filled the air. Shelves stacked with forgotten relics loomed overhead, and behind the counter sat Mr. Abrahams, an elderly man with deep wrinkles and a sharp, calculating gaze. He barely glanced up from the book in his hands as she approached. Elena Carter, he mused, flipping a page. You never come in unless you found something interesting. She hesitated, then pulled the pendant from her pocket, setting it carefully on the counter. Abrahams finally looked up. The moment his gaze landed on the pendant, his expression changed. The amusement faded, replaced by something darker, something Elena could only describe as fear. He didn't touch it. Instead, he reached for a magnifying glass and studied the engraving in silence. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice lower now. Elena hesitated. She didn't want to involve Lucas. Not yet. I just found it, she lied. Abraham snorted, unimpressed. You're a terrible liar, he exhaled, setting the magnifying glass down. This symbol, it hasn't been seen in decades. What does it mean? He studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. There was a family once. Powerful, wealthy, untouchable. People called them the Silver Bloods. Elena's grip on Lucas tightened. They were different. Abrahams continued. Gifted, some said. Cursed, said others. He tapped the pendant with a bony finger. This belonged to them. Elena swallowed hard. What happened to them? Abraham's gaze flickered toward the shop window as if checking for someone. They were wiped out, he said simply. Every last one. The words sent a chill down Elena's spine. She looked down at Lucas, now asleep in her arms. His silvery hair gleamed in the soft shop light. A child like him. A family wiped from history. A pendant with a forgotten symbol. Elena's breath hitched. Someone left him to die, she whispered. Abraham's jaw tightened. Then you need to run, he said, because if they find out he's still alive, they'll come back to finish what they started. The words rang in her ears long after she left the shop. As she walked back through the market, the city's familiar noise felt different. The chatter seemed heavier, the shadows stretched a little too long. Then she saw him. A man in a black suit, standing across the street. He wasn't browsing the market, wasn't talking to anyone. He was watching her, watching Lucas. Elena's pulse quickened. She turned sharply, weaving through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached her apartment building, forcing herself not to look back as she hurried inside and locked the door behind her. Her breaths came fast, her mind racing. The feeling from last night had been real. She was being watched. She looked down at Lucas, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. Whoever abandoned him hadn't done so out of desperation. They had wanted him gone. And now someone had noticed that he was still here. Elena pressed her back against the apartment door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The weight of Lucas in her arms was grounding, but the fear coiling in her chest refused to loosen. Someone had been watching them, not just with idle curiosity, with intent. She peeked through the window, her fingers tightening around the edge of the curtain. The man in the black suit hadn't moved. He stood across the street, near a lamppost, unmoving as the city bustled around him. Her stomach twisted. He wasn't just a bystander. He was waiting. Elena forced herself to think. Panicking wouldn't help. She had spent years surviving on the city's harsh streets, learning how to read danger before it struck. If she was right, if Lucas was somehow tied to the Silver Blood family that had been erased from history, then whoever this man was, he wasn't here to help. She exhaled sharply, pushing away the rising dread. She had to be smart. Lucas stirred in her arms, letting out a soft, contented sigh. His tiny hand clutched at the fabric of her sweater, as if sensing her tension. Elena ran a soothing hand over his silver hair. "We're gonna be okay," she whispered, though the words felt fragile. For now, she had to act normal. She moved away from the window, adjusting Lucas in her arms, and busied herself with making something to eat. If she suddenly stopped her routine, if she acted like she was scared, the man outside would know she had seen him. And if he knew that she knew, things could escalate quickly. She took slow, steady breaths, spooning formula into a warm bottle. As she fed Lucas, she kept her mind racing through possible next steps. She needed information. Abrahams had told her the Silver Blood family had been wiped out, but that didn't explain why someone was still watching for them. If they had been erased from history, then Lucas's existence shouldn't matter unless someone knew. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Nathan Wells. The name flickered through her mind like a beacon. He was a journalist, one of the few who had ever dared to investigate the city's buried secrets. If anyone had information about the Silver Bloods, it would be him. She dug through her old contacts, fingers trembling as she tapped out a message. "Elena, need to meet. Urgent. It's about something you wrote a few years back." Seconds felt like hours before. Her phone vibrated with a response. "Nathan, midnight. Warehouse on 42nd. No one follows you." She swallowed. Midnight. That gave her time to prepare, but also more time for things to go wrong. Lucas let out a small whimper, shifting in her arms, and she pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. They had been alone for less than 48 hours, yet she already knew she would die before letting anything happen to him. As night fell, the city outside blurred into neon lights and shadows. The man in the black suit had vanished, but Elena knew better than to think she was safe. She packed only the essentials: formula, diapers, a change of clothes, and wrapped Lucas snugly in a blanket. If she needed to run, she needed to run. She needed to be ready. The warehouse on 42nd was in the industrial district, a place where the city's noise faded into eerie silence, where streetlights flickered weakly against the looming skeletons of abandoned factories. Elena moved carefully, keeping to the back streets, checking her reflection in every glass surface to make sure she wasn't being followed. By the time she reached the warehouse, her nerves were frayed. Nathan was already there, leaning against a rusted metal beam, smoking a cigarette. His sharp green eyes flicked to her, then down to the bundle in her arms. "What the hell, Elena?" His voice was low, incredulous. "You didn't say this was about a kid." She ignored the accusation in his tone. "Do you know what this is?" She pulled the pendant from her pocket and held it up so he could see. Nathan stiffened. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his stubble jaw. Where did you find it? Elena hesitated. Nathan let out a dark chuckle. You always were a terrible liar. He dropped his cigarette, crushing it under his boot. I know what that is, and I know what that is, and I know what it means. But before I start talking, you need to tell me something first. His eyes locked onto hers, unreadable. Does anyone else know you have that kid? A shiver ran down her spine. Elena tightened her grip on Lucas. Why? Nathan sighed, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. Because if they do, you're already in deep. He turned back to her. That pendant, it belonged to the Silver Bloods, and if that kid is connected to them, then you're carrying around a ticking bomb. Elena's breath hitched. Why? Nathan's voice lowered. The Silver Bloods weren't just powerful, Elena. They were different. There were rumors, crazy, impossible rumors, that they weren't entirely like us. She frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated. Then, finally, he said, they were supposed to be evolved, smarter, stronger. Some even believed they had abilities. Elena's pulse pounded. She thought of Lucas's strange, knowing eyes, the way he seemed to sense things before they happened. Nathan continued, the Lazarus Society, they were an underground group obsessed with purity, with the idea that the human race could be perfected. They were obsessed with the Silver Bloods. Elena's mouth went dry. They called it Project Genesis. Nathan took a step closer. I found traces of the project years ago, but every time I tried to publish something, people disappeared. My sources dried up. The people who tried to expose it, gone. That's when I stopped digging. Elena's fingers clenched around Lucas's blanket. If the Silver Bloods were wiped out, she whispered, why does anyone still care? Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because the Lazarus Society believed the Silver Blood bloodline held the key to unlocking something buried in human DNA. If even one survived. His gaze dropped to Lucas. Elena's chest tightened. You're saying they were hunted? She whispered. Nathan nodded grimly. They weren't just erased, Elena. They were exterminated. A sickening silence fell over them. Elena rocked slightly on her heels, her mind spinning. I found him in a gutter, she murmured, barely able to say the words aloud. Like garbage. Someone wanted him dead. Nathan's jaw clenched. Then someone failed. Elena took a shaky breath. They're watching me, she admitted. A man in a black suit. I saw him outside my apartment. Nathan cursed under his breath. If they know where you are, then you don't have much time. You need to leave the city, tonight. Elena's instinct screamed at her to do the same. But the thought of running blindly, with no plan, no protection, left a cold pit in her stomach. Lucas stirred against her chest, his tiny fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater. I need to know more, she said. I need to know why they were wiped out, why they want him dead. Nathan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then we need to move fast, he said. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. I know someone who might be able to help. But if we do this, Elena, You need to be ready for what we find. Elena tightened her hold on Lucas. I'm ready. But deep down, she already knew the truth. This wasn't just about a family wiped from history. This was about a secret powerful enough to change everything. Elena moved quickly, keeping Lucas close to her chest as she and Nathan slipped out of the warehouse. The air was thick with tension, the night pressing in around them like an unseen force. The city felt different now, less like the home she had always known and more like a hunting ground where she was the prey. Every shadow stretched too long, every passing car sent a shiver down her spine. Nathan led her through back alleys, avoiding the main streets, his pace brisk but controlled. He had always been good at this, navigating the underbelly of the city like he belonged there. Elena wasn't sure whether that reassured her or terrified her. "Where are we going?" she asked in a hushed whisper, adjusting Lucas's blanket to keep him warm. Nathan glanced over his shoulder. "Safe house. A friend of mine keeps an old place near the waterfront. It's not much, but it'll get you off the radar for a while." Elena hesitated. "And then what?" Nathan exhaled sharply. "Then we figure out who's watching you and why they haven't made a move yet. If the Lazarus Society knows about him, they should have already taken action. The fact that they're waiting means something." Elena swallowed hard. The thought that there was a strategy behind their silence didn't make her feel any better. They turned onto a quieter street lined with shuttered shops and flickering streetlights. The waterfront wasn't far now. The air carried a faint scent of salt and oil from the docks. Then Nathan stopped abruptly. Elena nearly bumped into him. "What?" Nathan held up a hand, silencing her. His entire body had gone rigid, his eyes locked on something ahead. Elena followed his gaze. A black car sat parked at the end of the street, the same black car she had seen near her apartment earlier that day. Her blood turned to ice. Nathan turned, his voice low and urgent. "Keep walking. Casually, don't look back." Elena forced her legs to move. The weight of Lucas in her arms felt heavier now, as if he knew something was wrong. They crossed the street, slipping into a narrow alley between buildings. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the damp concrete, swallowed by the night. Then, a car door opened. Elena's breath hitched. Nathan grabbed her wrist. "Go." She ran. The alley was slick from the rain, her boots splashing through puddles as she sprinted. Nathan was just ahead, leading the way as they weaved through the labyrinth of back streets. Lucas let out a soft whimper, sensing her fear. She didn't dare look back. Footsteps. Multiple. They were being followed. Nathan veered left, leading them toward an old service tunnel beneath the train tracks. The metal gate was rusted, barely holding together. He grabbed it and yanked. "Locked." "Damn it," he hissed. Looking around, Elena's pulse pounded. The footsteps behind them were getting closer. Nathan scanned the area. Then his eyes landed on a fire escape. "Up," he ordered. Elena didn't argue. She gripped the cold metal rungs and started climbing, her muscles burning with the effort. Lucas was strapped securely against her chest, but she felt every movement, every shift of his tiny body. As she ascended, Nathan followed, pulling the ladder up behind him, just as three men rounded the corner below. Elena froze. They weren't ordinary men. They moved with precision, their dark suits blending into the night. One of them lifted what looked like a small scanner, sweeping it through the air. It beeped once, twice, then emitted a low, eerie hum. Nathan's grip tightened on the railing. That's bad. Elena didn't need him to explain. The scanner wasn't looking for them. It was looking for Lucas. They had technology. They weren't just tracking them visually, they were tracking him. Nathan motioned for her to keep climbing. Come on, we need to get across the rooftops. Elena climbed faster, her breath ragged. The fire escape led them to a rooftop littered with old satellite dishes and rusted vents. Nathan scanned the area, then pointed toward a bridge that connected to the next building. Elena ran. The moment her feet hit the bridge, she heard it. A gunshot. The metal railing sparked as a bullet grazed it, inches from where her hand had been. Nathan swore, ducking as another shot rang out. The men below weren't just chasing them anymore. They were trying to take them down. Elena gritted her teeth and kept moving. They reached the next building, scrambling over a low wall before dropping into a side alley. Nathan yanked open a rusted door, shoving her inside. The space was small and cluttered, filled with old tools and forgotten crates. A warehouse storage room, judging by the dust-covered machinery. Nathan slammed the door shut behind them, locking it. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he checked his phone. We need to move now, he said, dialing a number. Elena leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Who are they? She demanded. Nathan pressed the phone to his ear. The Lazarus Society doesn't send amateurs. They don't send threats. They send teams, and they send them to eliminate problems. Elena's stomach dropped. They were trying to kill us. Nathan gave her a grim look. No. They were trying to kill him. Elena's arms instinctively tightened around Lucas. The baby remained silent, his eyes open and eerily calm. A voice on the other end of the line picked up. Nathan spoke fast, low. A pause. Then a muffled response. Nathan hung up. We have 10 minutes to get to the docks. Elena swallowed. Who was that? Someone who owes me, Nathan said shortly. But after tonight, we're off the grid. He grabbed a nearby tarp, tossing it over their shoulders to make them less visible. Stay close. Move fast. Elena didn't hesitate. They slipped through the warehouse, exiting through a broken side door. The streets ahead were quieter now, the gunfire seemingly drawing no attention, probably silenced weapons. Nathan led the way, cutting through alley after alley. The scent of salt grew stronger. The docks were close. Elena kept checking behind them, expecting the men in suits to appear at any second. But the rooftops were empty, the streets silent. Something was wrong. Nathan seemed to sense it too. His pace slowed as they reached the final turn. Something's off, he murmured. Then a car engine revved. Before they could react, headlights flooded the alley. Elena spun. A black SUV barreled toward them. Nathan shoved her aside. The world tilted, glass shattered, tires screeched. Elena landed hard, her back slamming against the pavement, her arms still wrapped around Lucas. Pain shot through her, but she didn't let go. The SUV skidded to a stop. Doors swung open. And then they were surrounded. Elena's breath came fast. Nathan struggled to his feet beside her, his hands already curling into fists. A man stepped forward from the group. Older, sharp eyes, a presence that commanded silence. "You should have walked away," he said, his voice smooth, calculated. Elena held Lucas tighter. The man's gaze landed on the baby. "And as for the child," he murmured, his lips curling into something cold, "he was never meant to live." Elena's pulse pounded in her ears as the man in the dark suit stepped closer. His eyes, sharp and assessing, flickered over her before settling on Lucas. The way he looked at the baby, cold, detached, like an object instead of a child, sent a surge of protectiveness through her. She tightened her hold, instinctively shifting her body to shield Lucas from view. Nathan was already stepping forward, subtly placing himself between her and the men surrounding them. His posture was calm, but his fingers twitched at his sides. Ready. The man in charge gave a slow, knowing smile. "You don't even know what you're holding, do you?" Elena said nothing. He tilted his head, almost amused. "That child," he continued, gesturing lazily toward Lucas, "was meant to be erased. His existence is a mistake." Rage burned through her veins. "Then why is he still alive?" she demanded, voice steady, despite the storm inside her. The man exhaled, as if she were wasting his time. "Because someone in our ranks grew sentimental and failed to complete their task." His gaze hardened. "We won't make that mistake again." Nathan moved first. A flash of motion. His fist connected squarely with the man's jaw. The hit was brutal, unexpected, sending the man staggering back. The moment of shock rippled through the others. Then chaos exploded. Nathan spun, slamming his elbow into another attacker's throat before grabbing the man's wrist and twisting, disarming him in a single fluid motion. The gun clattered to the pavement. Elena turned to run. She had to get Lucas out of here. But two men lunged, blocking her path. One reached for Lucas. His hand barely grazed the blanket before Elena lashed out. She drove her knee into his ribs, her elbow following in a wild, desperate strike to his nose. He stumbled, and she used the opening to run. Nathan was still fighting, taking down another suit with a well-placed strike to the temple. But there were too many. A sharp crack, a gunshot. Elena ducked, heart hammering, expecting pain. But when she turned, she saw Nathan drop to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt. "No." Another gun cocked. "Enough," the leader growled. Elena froze as the barrel of a silenced pistol pointed directly at Lucas. Her breath caught. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to run, but one wrong move and... Her hands shook as she slowly raised them. Nathan was on the ground, still breathing but barely. The leader wiped blood from his lip where Nathan had hit him and sighed, sounding more annoyed than angry. "You should have never interfered," he said. Elena's mind raced. Stall. Think. Find a way out. "You don't have to do this," she said carefully, her voice controlled. "He's just a baby." The man chuckled, shaking his head. No, he's not. His gaze locked onto Lucas, something almost reverent in his expression. Do you know what you're carrying? What's flowing through his veins? Elena gritted her teeth. A child, not a weapon. The man smirked. You're wrong. He's both. Elena's fingers curled into fists. We don't have time for this, one of the men snapped. The leader exhaled sharply. You're right. He lifted the gun again. Lucas stirred. The air shifted. The street lights flickered. Briefly, almost imperceptibly, but Elena felt it. The moment changed, like the atmosphere itself had pulled taut. Lucas's tiny fingers twitched, and the gunman gasped, suddenly staggering backward as if something had pushed him. What the hell? Another streetlight shattered. Sparks rained onto the pavement. Lucas wasn't crying. He was watching. The leader's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. We're out of time, he muttered. Take the child. Elena reacted before she thought. She dropped to the ground, rolling just as a pair of hands snatched at empty air where Lucas had been. The moment she hit the pavement, she twisted, driving her foot into the attacker's kneecap. A sickening crack, a scream. Nathan, though bleeding, took advantage of the distraction, grabbing the discarded gun and firing, not at the men, but at the car's tires. The SUV jerked as the tire burst, throwing the men off balance. Elena ran. She barely registered Nathan limping after her, gun still clutched in his shaking hands. She only knew one thing. She had to get Lucas away. The docks loomed ahead. The water stretched like an endless void, a cold abyss, ready to swallow them. Nathan caught up panting, his face pale. There, he rasped, pointing toward a small boat rocking against the pier. A figure stood waiting, a woman in dark clothes, her face shadowed by the hood of her coat. Elena didn't hesitate. She sprinted onto the dock. Go! Go! Nathan shouted, shoving Elena forward as he turned to fire another shot. The bullet whizzed past her ear, striking one of the men behind them. The others hesitated, but only for a second. The leader, still standing, still watching, didn't move. He didn't need to. His gaze locked onto Elena, a silent promise. This isn't over. Then the boat lurched away from the dock, the woman at the helm gunning the engine. The roar of the motor swallowed the sound of shouts behind them. Elena collapsed against the side, holding Lucas so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against hers. Nathan slumped beside her, groaning in pain. The woman in the hood didn't speak. She only glanced at Elena, then at the child in her arms. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, she said finally, her voice steady, but edged with something close to fear. Elena let out a shuddering breath. Then tell me. The woman stared at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out something small. A pendant. An exact replica of the one Lucas had been wearing. Elena's heart stopped. Welcome to the war, the woman said softly. The boat cut through the water, carrying them into the unknown. The boat sliced through the dark water, leaving behind the city that had nearly swallowed them whole. The roar of the engine filled the air, but Elena barely heard it over the sound of her own pounding heart. The weight of Lucas in her arms was the only thing keeping her grounded. Nathan groaned beside her, his hand pressed to the gunshot wound in his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark against his pale skin. He was conscious, but barely. Elena looked up at the woman who had rescued them. She still hadn't lowered her hood, but the wind had pushed it back just enough for Elena to catch a glimpse of sharp, calculating eyes beneath. The woman's grip on the wheel was steady, her posture tense but controlled. She wasn't panicked. She had expected this. Elena didn't trust her. "Who are you?" she demanded, tightening her hold on Lucas. "Where are you taking us?" The woman didn't answer right away. She cut the engine slightly, letting the boat glide into the fog, rolling over the open water. Then she finally turned, her gaze settling on Elena with quiet intensity. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Monroe," she said. "And if you want to keep that child alive, you're going to have to listen carefully." Elena stiffened. Dr. Monroe. The name struck something deep in her memory. Nathan had mentioned her before. A former researcher, someone who had worked with the Lazarus Society before she disappeared. "You used to be one of them," Elena said, her voice sharp. Dr. Monroe didn't deny it. "I used to believe in what they were doing," she admitted. "But I was wrong." Nathan coughed, shifting painfully. "That's an understatement." Elena ignored him, her mind racing. What do they want with Lucas? Dr. Monroe studied the baby, her expression unreadable. Elena bristled. "He's a child." Dr. Monroe's gaze softened slightly, but there was something in her eyes that unsettled Elena. A deep weariness. Maybe even fear. "He's not just a child," Dr. Monroe said. "He's the last of a bloodline that was supposed to be erased. And if the Lazarus Society gets their hands on him, they won't kill him." Elena's stomach twisted. "Then what will they do?" Dr. Monroe hesitated. Nathan, despite his pain, pushed himself up slightly. "They want to experiment on him, don't they?" Dr. Monroe exhaled, nodding. "They believe the silver blood lineage holds the key to something they've been chasing for decades. Evolution, power. They don't know exactly what he is yet, but they want to find out." Elena's grip on Lucas tightened. She didn't care what they thought he was. He was hers, and she wasn't going to let them take him. Nathan let out a low curse. "Where the hell are we going?" Dr. Monroe turned back to the wheel. "Somewhere safe." Elena wasn't convinced. Nowhere is safe if they can track him. Dr. Monroe reached into her coat and pulled out a small metal device, sleek about the size of a matchbox. She held it up. "They're using a genetic tracker," she said. "It picks up specific markers in his DNA. It's how they found you so quickly." Elena's blood ran cold. "Then they can still find us." "Not for much longer," Dr. Monroe said. She flipped a switch on the device, and it let out a faint pulse, a strange, almost humming vibration in the air. Lucas twitched slightly in her arms. Elena tensed. "What did you just do?" Dr. Monroe's expression remained calm. "I've scrambled their signal. They won't be able to track him, at least not for a while." Elena wanted to believe her, but trust wasn't something she could afford right now. The boat slowed as they approached a hidden dock concealed between jagged cliffs. A small cabin sat nestled between the trees, its windows dark against the night. "This is where we lay low," Dr. Monroe said, cutting the engine completely. Nathan groaned, trying to sit up. "I'd prefer a five-star hotel, but I guess this'll do." Elena ignored his sarcasm. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" Dr. Monroe met her gaze steadily. "Because if I wanted to turn you in, I would have let them take you." She had a point. But that didn't mean Elena had to trust her. They made their way onto the dock, Nathan leaning heavily on Elena as they climbed the short path to the cabin. The inside was sparse but functional. An old fireplace, a few pieces of worn furniture, medical supplies stacked in the corner. Dr. Monroe moved quickly, grabbing a first aid kit and tending to Nathan's wound. He flinched but didn't complain. Elena sat on the couch, rocking Lucas gently as he began to drift off again. She should have been exhausted, but her mind wouldn't rest. She looked at Dr. Monroe. "Tell me everything." The woman sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. The Silverbloods weren't just wealthy elites. They were something else entirely. The Lazarus Society believed they were the next stage of human evolution. Nathan scoffed. "Let me guess. Superpowers." Dr. Monroe's expression didn't change. Elena's breath hitched. "Are you saying Lucas is different?" Dr. Monroe hesitated. Then she looked at the baby, at his silver hair, the faint glow in his eyes. "We don't know exactly what the Silverbloods were," she admitted. "Some say they had abilities, subtle but real, intuition beyond normal human limits, perception that bent reality in ways we couldn't understand. Some people called it a gift, others called it a curse." Elena swallowed hard. She remembered the way the lights had flickered, the way the man had staggered backward without being touched. Lucas had done that. She shook her head. "He's just a baby." Dr. Monroe's voice was quiet. For now. A tense silence settled over the room. Then Nathan muttered, "So what do we do? We can't run forever." Dr. Monroe exhaled. "We don't run. We make them think he's gone." Elena frowned. "How?" Dr. Monroe pulled out a folder, flipping it open. Inside were documents, fake identities, medical records, even a birth certificate for a child that didn't exist. Elena's stomach turned. "You want us to disappear?" Dr. Monroe nodded. "It's the only way to keep him safe." Elena looked down at Lucas. He slept soundly, oblivious to the war raging around him. She had spent her entire life scraping by, fighting for every inch of survival. Now, she was about to erase herself completely. For him. For the first time since finding him in that alley, she realized something. She wasn't just protecting him anymore. She was his mother, and she would do whatever it took to keep him safe. She met Dr. Monroe's gaze, steel in her voice. "Tell me what I have to do." The cabin was eerily silent. The only sound was the soft crackling of the dying fire and the rhythmic breathing of Lucas against Elena's chest. The moment she spoke, "Tell me what I have to do." "Doctor." Monroe's expression changed. The weariness that had lingered in her features sharpened into something else. Determination. She pushed the folder of fake identities across the wooden table, but Elena didn't reach for it. Not yet. Nathan, still pale from blood loss, let out a low chuckle. You do realize once you go down this road, there's no coming back, right? Elena's jaw tightened. There was never a way back, not after I picked him up from that alley. Dr. Monroe gave a small nod, as if she had expected nothing less. Then we moved fast. Elena finally reached for the documents, flipping through them. Her name was no longer Elena Carter. It was Marie Dalton now. Lucas was no longer Lucas. He was listed as William Dalton, her legally adopted son. There were forged medical records showing a normal birth in a small town hospital. It was as if they had never existed before this moment. "They'll know it's fake," Elena murmured. "They'll suspect," Dr. Monroe corrected, "but we won't give them a trail to follow." Elena glanced at Nathan. "And you? What happens to you?" Nathan leaned his head back against the couch, letting out a tired breath. "Guess I'm a ghost now too," he smirked. But there was a grimness to it, though I doubt they'll believe I died that easily. Elena's stomach twisted. "You can't stay with us," Dr. Monroe answered for him. "No, he's already too deep in their system. They know him. He'd be a liability." Nathan gave a lazy salute. "Don't worry about me, Carter. I'll be around, just not visible." Elena hated the idea of leaving him behind, but she knew he was right. The longer they stayed together, the easier they were to track. Dr. Monroe pulled out a map, laying it flat on the table. "There's a train leaving in 3 hours. It heads west, through the back roads. You'll take it as far as Salt Lake City. From there, I have a contact who can get you further off the grid." Elena nodded, committing it all to memory. She had no luggage, no belongings except for what she had carried since the night she had found Lucas. And that, she realized, made things easier. They wouldn't be tracking Elena Carter, a struggling street vendor from the city. They would be searching for someone who no longer existed. She held Lucas tighter. Dr. Monroe's voice softened, as if she could sense the weight of what Elena was carrying. Elena let out a slow breath. "I know." And she did. It didn't make it any less terrifying. The train station was nearly empty at this hour. The overhead lights buzzed dimly, casting flickering shadows across the concrete platform. Elena kept her head down, her hood pulled low to shield her face from the few scattered cameras. Lucas was tucked securely in a sling beneath her coat, bundled against the cold. His tiny breaths warmed her skin. Nathan had come with them as far as he dared, but now he stood just outside the station entrance, leaning against a pillar. His wound had been patched up, but he still moved stiffly. Elena turned to him. "This isn't goodbye," she said. Nathan smirked, but his usual sarcasm was absent. "No, it's not." A pause. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a small folded note. He pressed it into her hand. "Burn this after you read it," he muttered. Elena glanced down at it, then back at him. "What is it?" Nathan's gaze flickered. The name of the man who ordered the Silverblood family's execution. Elena's breath hitched. He held her stare. "Someday, you're gonna want answers, and when you do, you'll know where to start." Elena clenched the note tightly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Nathan took a step back. "Now go, before I change my mind and do something reckless." Elena gave him one last look before turning away. She stepped onto the train just as the final boarding call echoed through the station. The doors slid shut behind her. The train rattled along the tracks, cutting through the vast darkness beyond the city. Elena sat by the window, watching the skyline shrink into the distance, the glow of civilization slowly swallowed by the endless stretch of countryside. Lucas slept soundly against her, unaware of the world shifting around him. She traced a finger over his silver hair, her mind replaying everything Dr. Monroe had told her. The Silverbloods weren't just a powerful family. They were something else. Something the Lazarus Society had spent decades trying to control. And now the last of them was in her arms. For the first time since this nightmare began, Elena allowed herself to think beyond the present. If Lucas truly was different, if he really did have some gift locked inside him, then what did that mean for his future? Would he be forced to run forever? Would they ever be safe? She had spent her entire life fighting to survive, but this was different. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about his. And for the first time, she realized that running wasn't enough. One day, she would have to fight back. But not yet. Not while he was still so small, so fragile. Elena exhaled slowly, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. Lucas stirred slightly, as if he had heard her. She smiled despite everything. As long as they were together, she would find a way, even if it meant burning the world down to protect him. The train rocked gently as it cut through the dark expanse of countryside, the rhythmic hum of the rails lulling the few passengers into quiet stillness. Elena sat by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out into the vast emptiness beyond. The city was far behind them now, swallowed by the night. There was no turning back. Lucas slept soundly against her chest, his tiny body rising and falling with each steady breath. His silver hair peeked from beneath the folds of the blanket she had wrapped around him, catching the dim glow of the train's overhead lights. He looked peaceful, normal, but nothing about this was normal. Elena tightened her hold on him, her mind replaying the events of the last 24 hours. The ambush, the gunfire, the way the air itself had shifted when Lucas had stirred, as if the world had bent around him. And the look in the leader's eyes, the cold certainty that this wasn't over. They would come again. She had no doubt about that. Dr. Monroe's plan would buy them time, but it wasn't a permanent solution. Even with new identities, new locations, the Lazarus Society wouldn't stop. They had spent decades erasing the silver blood lineage. They wouldn't allow a single child to be the loose thread that unraveled it all. Elena let out a slow breath, pressing her lips against Lucas's soft skin. She had spent her entire life running, always a step ahead of the world that sought to swallow her whole. She had never had anything worth fighting for before. Now she did. A rustling sound pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up just in time to see a man shifting in the seat across from her. He had been there where she boarded, but she hadn't paid him much attention. Now, with the weight of paranoia pressing in on her, she noticed everything. The way he kept his hat pulled low, obscuring most of his face. The way he had his hands tucked into his coat pockets, unmoving. He wasn't sleeping like the others. He wasn't sleeping like the others. He was watching. Elena's pulse quickened. She turned slightly, adjusting Lucas in a way that let her slide her hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the small knife she had taken from Nathan before they parted ways. It wasn't much, but it was something. The train's overhead speaker crackled, announcing the next stop. They weren't getting off there. She would wait until the last station, the one deep in the rural stretches of the West, where Dr. Monroe's contact would be waiting. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted, even here. The man finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat. He turned his head, just enough for her to glimpse his eyes, a deep, piercing blue, the same unnatural blue as Lucas's. Elena's breath caught. She knew that color. She had seen it in the old photographs Dr. Monroe had shown her, the faded images of silver blood ancestors, of people who had been wiped from existence. The man knew she had seen him. He gave a slow, measured nod. Not a threat, not an attack, just acknowledgement. Elena's grip on her knife tightened. "Who are you?" she murmured, low enough that no one else would hear. The man hesitated. Then, just as the train began to slow for the upcoming station, he stood. For a moment, she thought he would walk away, but instead, he leaned down slightly, just close enough that she could hear his whispered words over the hum of the train. "You're not alone." Then he was gone, disappearing into the next car before she could react. Elena's heart pounded against her ribs. She turned her gaze back to Lucas, brushing a hand over his soft hair. She had always assumed she and Lucas were alone in this, that they were the last remnants of something long buried. But if that man was telling the truth, then maybe, just maybe, there were more of them out there. More survivors. More people like Lucas. A flicker of something new ignited in her chest. Not just fear. Hope. The train continued forward, carrying them toward the unknown. "Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey." This story was more than just an escape. It was about survival, resilience, and the undeniable power of love. Elena didn't just run to protect Lucas. She chose to fight for him, even when the odds were stacked against her. In life, we often face moments where everything seems impossible, where the world tries to dictate our fate. But just like Elena, we all have a choice to stand, to protect what we love, and to never let fear decide our future. Perhaps the greatest lesson here is that no one is ever truly alone. Even in the darkest moments, there is always hope, sometimes in the most unexpected places. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We bring you more thrilling stories, deeper mysteries, and unforgettable journeys. Hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Because some stories aren't just meant to be told, they're meant to be felt.